Britain's former Prime Minister, David Cameron, has resigned as a Conservative Member of Parliament, triggering a by-election. The former Prime Minister had said he would continue as an MP until the next general election. Asked about his legacy, he said he hoped his time would be remembered for a strong economy and important social reforms, and that he had transformed a Conservative Party that was in the doldrums into a modernising force. Under Cameron's leadership, property prices inflated hugely, but incomes have hardly moved. The country also has enormous debts, despite promises of financial responsibility, and this has created fears of an economic collapse. Hate crimes, racist attacks, and street violence are up, and even though millions opposed it, Cameron insisted on participating in dangerous foreign military action which has contributed to terrorist problems and civil war. The British public are living with the consequences. Millions cannot afford to buy a home, others live with the risk of being attacked for racist motives, and there is an ever-present fear of the terror threat, which has been increased by his foreign policy decisions. And thanks to his failed attempt to convince the UK to remain in the European Union, everyone who travels now finds it more expensive thanks to a weaker pound. Why has British society become so violent? And how much did the former Prime Minister really care about poverty and financial risk now facing the UK? Simple questions with important answers. Now, David Cameron broke a promise by resigning from Parliament before the next general election. How much did the public trust him, and why?
I did believe that Cameron would stay as Prime Minister. However, I do understand his decision.
It's hard to actually know how to trust politicians these days, especially since people go breaking their promises. For example, Nigel Farage, and he was promising to put all that money after Brexit into the NHS. So I'm a sceptic as far as things go. So to be honest, it didn't surprise me that he'd actually back out like that.
As much as I trust any politician, I think the particular breaking point for him was probably when it turned out that he didn't actually have a plan for Brexit vote. I mean, it's all very well wanting the vote to go one way or the other, but as a government official, it's kind of your responsibility to make sure you plan for all eventualities, and considering it was a 50-50 choice, it's not that difficult to narrow down your options.
I'm always hesitant when it comes to politicians, I think because of some of their previous track record, so to say I've wholeheartedly trusted him would be lying. So to a certain degree I wasn't surprised. I think often my experience has been, sadly, politicians say one thing and then a few months later change their mind.
I don't think I really trusted him at all, to be honest. I'm Labour, so I kind of didn't really kind of believe in what he said, and I kind of thought the whole kind of thing was quite risky in the first place, and I think the backlash of that was quite expected that he was going to leave, so I kind of thought he was going to.
Not really, because he hasn't really made an impact on the community and stuff. So when I heard about that, it didn't really surprise me. I knew it was coming anyway.
David Cameron's the most dishonest Prime Minister of my lifetime. He just said whatever he thinks will help him get elected. He promised the referendum whilst wanting to stay in, just as a way of undermining UKIP's growing support. He promised to do things for poor people, but inequality of wealth has dramatically worsened during his 6 years. All the new wealth created has gone to a very small elite of bankers and so on. And ordinary people are most probably poorer now than they've been for decades, with a lot of people pushed into poverty, lives being wrecked. I think not just the most dishonest Prime Minister of my lifetime, but one of the most brutal in the way he's abused the ordinary people of Britain.
Yes, I never had much faith in David Cameron. He'd already, of course, broken a promise that he wouldn't resign as Prime Minister when the Brexit vote went against his advice. So that was already one promise broken, and this second promise, I think, was broken because of the forthcoming report on Libya. The very next day, the Foreign Select Affairs Committee reported that the Libya incursion, the Libyan war, had been a disaster, and Cameron would have had to answer for that war. That was his war, his intervention, and it would have been something which he would have had to face, both questioning by the committee and questioning by the Commons. So I think he resigned in order to avoid that.
Under Cameron's leadership, property prices rose massively, while salaries almost stalled, meaning buying a home has become virtually impossible for a large proportion of people in Britain. Did the public feel Cameron, the son of a banker, actually cared?
Honestly, just from a tourist perspective, property prices are insane in the UK. So I can imagine how people will struggle, especially without salaries going up. I don't think he cared all that much because honestly it wouldn't affect him personally.
I don't really think he can understand the situation most people live in. He already has his house, his cars, he has his life figured out. But the people in the streets, they don't really know what they're gonna do once they get children, they need to pay rent. I don't know if David Cameron really pays his taxes. Maybe he doesn't. He finds a way to keep them and just don't pay. But I don't really think he understands the situation the people are in.
I think he cared, but he didn't actually take into consideration the fact that prices are going up, and me, being 23, I feel like I'll never be able to own a home because prices are going up, but my salary isn't increasing with minimum wage.
Yeah, because if he just leaves at a moment of crisis when when a normal person would stay to help or to improve things, he left, so it shows us that you just don't care, I guess.
He possibly thinks he cares. I doubt he really cares. I doubt he don't experience it. Can't experience it. So my daughter's in that position at the moment, and there's no way he understands.
The tragedy of our housing crisis is, Cameron's made it worse, but we've had 35 years of making it worse. Mrs Thatcher stopped building council housing. Shamefully, Tony Blair carried on with that policy. Before Mrs Thatcher was elected 35 years ago, we used to build 400,000 homes a year in Britain. Half of those were by councils for rent. She stopped that. We now build about 1,400 homes a year. They're virtually all for sale. And so we've gone from having I used to be the chair of housing in Camden. When someone got to the top of the waiting list, we offered them a choice of 6 new homes. Inconceivable today. And the best way of creating jobs is actually to have public funded house building. It creates more employment than any other form of public spending. So I denounce Cameron, but he's part of a long legacy of prime ministers who've neglected our housing, and it's now a terrible crisis, and people are being forced out of many of our cities because they can't afford to live there. And we're going to get inequality and social division worsening. And that's why I'm delighted that under Jeremy Corbyn, we'd have a major house building programme of building council homes for rent and getting ordinary people the chance to have somewhere decent to live.
No, I don't think he cared, but I think this is also a very long story in Britain. The reason why house prices have risen over such a long period of time, and the reason why so many people are now priced out of buying a house, is because of the failure to build public housing. Once under the Thatcher government, council house building ground to a halt, and no government since then has reversed Thatcher's legislation, has reversed the right to buy legislation or built significant numbers of council houses. It pushed all the demand into the private sector. And in fact, that demand now has been so intense that it's pushed up house prices so far that actually there are falling numbers of house owners in this country. The real big beneficiaries are the buy-to-let landlords. So now it's not just the case that you can't get a council house, you can't afford to buy a house either, and you're pushed into the hands of rapacious landlords. That's a housing disaster, and successive governments, starting with the Thatcher government, are responsible for it.
Under Cameron, the UK's current account deficit reached a record £100 billion, with some warning of economic meltdown. Has the government warned the public enough, or tried to hide it?
I think Cameron and Osborne did have a tough time over the last 6 years in trying to reduce what arguably the largest deficit we've ever seen in this country. And they have reduced the deficit by a large amount. I think their targets were far too high and unrealistic, but it has clearly come down.
The fact that that's the first I've heard of it probably gives you the answer to that one, I think. I think they're probably, if anything, they're probably worried that given the reaction to the last economic meltdown was about 2 steps removed from setting Canary Wharf on fire and hanging the people inside, they probably don't want to let us know that kind of thing's happening again.
Well, it's hard as a public to actually understand where this money's going, because they say they've spent that much, but actually in news, and to be honest, I think that at GCSE level politics should be taught, because we don't know where that money's going, and they don't advertise it enough, and there's not many people that actually tune into the politics to actually watch it on TV. So we have no clue where that money's going. So the only thing the public can do is question it.
Possibly, yes. It wasn't really a major aspect that he used within, whilst he was Prime Minister, that it could, it all goes up, but he never really made it public awareness that it possibly could go up.
I think they've been trying to conceal it so that there's no worry in the public, because they want the public to think everything's going fine, everything's fine, but there's probably a lot that we don't know about that they're just hiding away from us.
I mean, the question of our deficit is clearly a major problem. Before the banking crisis, it was 40% of our national wealth. Now it's 80% and still rising. But we need to remember, at the end of the Second World War, it was 2.5 times our national wealth, much bigger than now. And that incoming Labour government didn't say, oh, we need austerity to reduce the debt. They created full employment, massive public sector investment, they got people back to work, they encouraged private sector investment, and the deficit was virtually brought down to almost zero over the next 30 years. And that's what we've got to do now. A major programme of public and private investment, getting people back to work so they're not drawing down benefits, but they're earning money, they're paying taxes, we're exporting more things abroad. The way to reduce that deficit is to go for not an anti-austerity programme, but a growth programme.
Well, I think the deficit certainly is large, but although the absolute figure, the absolute amount of money may be the largest in our history, the percentage compared with the size of the economy certainly isn't. We were much more indebted after the Second World War, and that was a time when we built the National Health Service and built the welfare state. So I think the big lie that the government's told is that this is unsustainable and that ordinary people have to pay for it through austerity measures and through cuts to the welfare state and the NHS. That is simply not the case. What is true is that the government's way of dealing with this problem has been counterproductive. They haven't actually invested in roads and rail and the housing infrastructure and in the NHS. That would have resulted in growth in the economy, more people being employed, more stable jobs, more wages in people's pockets, and a reflation of the economy. What the government has done in cutting back is exactly the wrong thing to do, which may well tilt the economy into a new recession.
Let's review the facts. Cameron's premiership led to a current account deficit equaling £4,000 for every household. The national debt now stands at £24,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. And thousands of militants who were backed by David Cameron's intervention in Syria are now fighting against British forces. This evidently creates risks in the streets of the UK. Hate crimes, racist attacks and street violence rose sharply under Cameron, and by another 50% since the country's Brexit vote in June 2016. Why has British society become so violent? The public said this.
I think today it's just a dog-eat-dog world. A lot of people are just in it for themselves. People don't really look out for each other. It's all about me, what am I doing? And if these people are coming into our country hearing all these lies, people like they're stealing our jobs, and that's really not the picture. Actually, they're contributing to our society, and a lot of people just don't see that.
I think it's become violent because, for example, as you just said about Brexit, the vote was half and half, And then since Brexit, there's been a lot of talk about it. So I know it was half and half, meaning like half the people wanted out, half wanted in, and that's clashing. And because it's clashing, it's making people more violent.
You know, as a South African living in a violent society, I must say I thought I'd feel a lot safer in the UK, but I don't.
I think people just had enough of what's going on, because like the majority of that voted like Brexit, they keep on complaining about people taking their jobs and stuff, but if you look at it properly, the people that are like doing the most for this country are from different other countries, like the builders and stuff. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense. So people just had enough of how they're being treated here.
I don't think I would directly correlate it to Brexit. I think frustrations definitely have increased in certain areas. And there's all sorts wrong with society. I think, remember someone once said to me, the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart, first and foremost. I think a lot of these problems are recycled problems that we've had in the past in other shapes and forms, manifested throughout generations. So I don't think it's anything new, just maybe repackaged in another way.
Well, this, once again, is a long tradition. I mean, back in 1906, the Daily Mail headline was "Jews bring crime and disease to Britain." Then it was the Irish being demonised, then black people from the Caribbean, and more recently it's been Muslims and East Europeans. The simple fact is, the state of the mess of our economy is not because immigrants have come here and taken our jobs and our homes. It's because we've had a succession of government that haven't gone for growth, haven't created new jobs, haven't created new homes. And of course, the right-wing media don't want an honest debate about that, because it would lead to rich tax dodgers having to pay their full fair share of tax to fund a proper programme. And so it's always blame migrants. We've been doing that, and not just here in Britain, for over 100 years, but in virtually every country around the world, it's blame the migrants. Don't look at the real cause of the problem, which is our small elite, who screw us for every penny they can get, then launder it offshore through some Panamanian dodgy company. We need to keep our wealth here and invest here.
I think a lot of this is driven by the political establishment. It isn't just the Brexit campaign, where the debate over immigration in particular was poisonous and racist on both sides, and both sides were led by sections of the right and the Tory party. But before that, if you remember, the London mayoral campaign, where David Cameron led a racist assault on Sadiq Khan, the Labour candidate, which was echoed in the press. That was probably the most racist political campaign that I can remember in this country, certainly since the Smethwick by-election campaign in the 1960s, which was a notoriously racist campaign, again led by the Tory party. So I think if we're looking for a group of people to blame for the increase in racist attacks, we need to look squarely at the people in government who've been pushing this over immigration, pushing this over questions of treatment of the Muslim community related to the war on terror. After all, we have an institutionalised PREVENT programme, which is a racist programme, which involves racial profiling, which involves snooping and observation of the Muslim community, and a portrayal and demonisation of the Muslim community, which is bound to feed racism and indeed, in a minority of cases, produce racist attacks. So I think that if we're looking for an explanation, that will be it, and that's a large part of David Cameron's rather sad and rather disgraceful legacy.
Despite growing public opposition, Cameron followed the US in backing unknown armed militants in Syria, many of whom went on to be ISIL terrorists, slaughtering civilians around the world. How do the public think Cameron got away with this?
I have no idea why we do this, and we sell armaments all over the world. We're, as you probably know, one of the leading armaments sellers in the world. I think it's France, us and America, maybe the Germans.
We're actually number 2.
We're number 2, aren't we? Yes, that's right. Well, what do you expect? You know, chickens come home to roost. You reap what you sow.
Just hiding it under the covers, not getting enough publicity out for it, avoiding questions like he did when Corbyn was questioning him on that PMQs. He just avoided every single question, and I think he's became very good at that.
I think politics is such a sensitive thing that people You know, people make decisions in terms of their own interest, and a lot of it is hidden from the public. So I don't know if he had some agenda with that. To be honest, I'm not actually sure.
His position has power to a certain degree. If that isn't indeed actually fully the case, again, I'm just going by what you're saying. But I think he's got a lot of friends in high places. I presume there's a lot of media, which there has a certain amount of sway on as well. So I think that's probably part of it. But again, I need more evidence.
But it wasn't made publicly aware, was it? His decision, not all of his decisions were made public. And I think he got away with it for a long time, and then for him to resign and for all of these things to be brought to light has just shown his true colours, if I'm quite honest.
Because they hide stuff and they don't tell the people what he actually did, or they just give it a twist and make it sound good, while it's not.
Part of the problem is there's nothing new about this. I mean, we've been America's little poodle since the end of the Second World War. I mean, we've also had endless interventions in the Middle East. We helped overthrow the democratically elected Iranian government in 1953. We invaded Egypt along with France and Israel in 1956. I mean, one after another. We can't be surprised that these countries are now in chaos. We've overthrown their governments, we've supported brutal dictators very often. It's led to wars, it's led to migration, and it's helped fuel at the moment Islamophobia over much of the Western world. Well, I think what attracts me about our Labour leadership is they will not have another invasion of the Middle East. Every time we've done this, it's made matters worse. The West needs to keep out of its interventions in the Middle East. It was always about trying to control the flow of oil and control the wealth that oil generates. Let's let the peoples of the Middle East own and control their own economies and get the benefits from their oil. Then they'll be able to see their economies grow, we'll trade more, we'll do better. But we've got no right to invade other countries.
Well, the primary reason why Cameron was able to pass a vote eventually in the House of Commons for intervention in Syria, you must remember, of course, that he lost the initial vote when Ed Miliband and the Labour Party opposed it. The reason he was able to win a second one is because large numbers of Labour MPs supported the Tory position, and they did so shamefully. Not so much because they believed what David Cameron was telling them, as because they wanted to attack Jeremy Corbyn, who of course stood out against it. So if there's an explanation of why the political class accepted the ridiculous lie that there were 75,000 moderate insurgents in Syria that the UK government could support, that would provide ground troops if the United Kingdom provided air cover. That lie, and it has turned out to be a gross lie, was peddled by Cameron, but the only reason he could turn it into an effective intervention, why he could deploy the RAF in the Syrian conflict, is because Labour MPs bought the lie and supported him.
While David Cameron himself has praised his own performance as Prime Minister, the public he was supposed to serve takes a less admiring view. Without the benefit of a wealthy background or close personal protection, they live with the economic and potential terrorist consequences of his actions. Britain's former Prime Minister broke a promise by resigning before the next election. He led the country towards economic chaos and divided it over Europe. Hate crime and violence have soared, and his foreign policies have ravaged the world. Cameron came to power amid great expectations, but he's left Parliament and the country with worse problems than it started with. Can anyone really be proud of a legacy like that?